This evening, Noru is going to talk to us on the subject of what's wrong with the Middle East, uncovering the issues that plague the world's most troubled region. Over to you, Noru.
Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you everybody for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it, especially since I can't claim to be an MP. You have all kinds of machers giving presentations, I understand. I can put a few letters after my name, but MP certainly isn't there. I'm going to share my screen, and you should be able to see now the cover page of my presentation. And the question we're asking, as Alan said, is what's wrong with the Middle East? But you know what? First of all, maybe we are a little bit unfair. Why assume that there is something wrong with the Middle East? Is there something wrong with the Middle East? Well, what I have here is a very partial, very incomplete list of armed conflicts, of violent conflicts that took place in the Middle East. And I think, it kind of goes without saying, if you look at this list and the number of fatalities, I think we can agree that there is something wrong with the Middle East. But let's take a step back and try to understand what is the Middle East, because this is an overused and sometimes a rather poorly understood term. It's a bit of a vague term. I think technically this is what we would call the Middle East. So it includes Egypt, it includes Turkey, it includes Iran. It does not include places like Afghanistan and Pakistan, okay? This is the Middle East. But and then there's an older name, Levant, which refers to a smaller piece of territory without Egypt and so on. And then we have various other terms. We talk sometimes about the Arab world, don't we? We talk about another term that is commonly used is MENA, Middle East and North Africa. And even something like MENAP. This is Middle East, North Africa, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. So people talk about the Middle East, but sometimes they mean different things. I'm going to say Middle East because this is shorter, but I'm going to refer actually most of the time to Middle East and North Africa because it's kind of a geopolitical unit, I think. So that's what I consider to be the Middle East. I'll tell you what isn't the Middle East, because that's important as well. For some people reduce the Middle East to Israel and its environs, okay? So the Arab-Israeli conflict suddenly becomes the conflict, the Middle East conflict, right? And the peace process, the Middle East peace process, as if there is only one conflict in the Middle East. That's obviously wrong. There isn't one conflict, and the Arab-Israeli conflict isn't the only one, isn't even the biggest one in the Middle East. But let's take just a moment or two and analyze this name, because I know we're all familiar with it, but it's actually quite a weird name. Why call it East? I mean, if you live in this place, it's not East, it's here. And if you live in places like India, then it's certainly not East, it's to the west of India. So why East? Well, clearly it's called East because this is a name that's been invented by Westerners. It's only East when seen from the West. And even the older term I mentioned, Levant, has to do with East, where the sun rises. Now, why middle though? Again, a rather weird term, because there used to be an area called the Near East. In the 19th century, beginning of 20th century, they were speaking about the Near East. It's an area that we would call today the Balkans. It used to be part of the Ottoman Empire, most of it. And so they had the Near East, and of course they had the the Far East. And the Middle East, they called it that because it's kind of between the two. But the weird thing and the interesting thing here is that even people who live in that area call it the Middle East. Okay, Ash-Sharq al-Awsat in Arabic. That's translated as the Middle East. Even the older name Mashriq comes from the same root you see here, which means east. Or in Hebrew, Hamizrach HaTichon, it translates exactly the same, the Middle East. It all comes from these roots. I'm not going to do a linguistic analysis here, but I think it's quite interesting that we have a name that was invented, defined by foreigners, but it's the only name that even people who live in the Middle East use. So I think this already indicates something. It indicates that people this is a region with not a very strong sense of regional identity. I mean, people in Europe call it Europe, a European name. They don't call it for by some foreign name. So, you know, if we have already one takeaway, I think, which is there are certain identity issues in this region. But why are we even discussing so much the Middle East? Why is it so important? What's so special about it? Well, it is actually quite a special place. First of all, geography. From a geographic point of view, if you look at this, it's a bridge. It's a bridge between three continents, three large land masses. The way I would like you to imagine the Middle East, it's like a three-way bridge between these, or among, I should say, these continents, okay? And this is exacerbated by the fact that there are deserts around. So any traffic is channeled through these places, through the Middle East. This is true even today when we have modern means of communication, but still the deserts have poor infrastructure. And so if you want to travel, you have to go through these passages. It's a place of passage. And it's always been that. This is the Silk Road, okay? The famous Silk Road. And you can see here what I mean by the three-way bridge. It's like a hub. And then geography, to a certain extent at least, drives history. So historically, this place was kind of at the border or at the fault line of empires from the early antiquity, and it continues to this day, actually, at the fault line, at the interface between strong, powerful states, powerful interests. And then one more thing I would mention, which is special about the Middle East, coming to modern times. This thing is special, okay? Most of the reserves of oil and gas are located in the Middle East and North Africa. And this is, I think we can agree, very important. You know, it's difficult to do this on Zoom. If we were doing this, if I were able to be with you in the same room, I would ask the question, what do you see in this picture? And people usually give me answers like there's a lot of people, there's cars moving, there's a lot of light. Actually, what you should say is you see a lot of energy. All these lights, you know, the air conditioning units, the cars moving, all this would not be possible without energy. Energy is so very important. in today's world. And energy is still very much about oil and gas. So just to do the maths here, we have geography, an interesting geography. We have energy, oil and gas. This, if we sum it up, results in strategic interest. The Middle East is an area of strong strategic interest. It's been like that in the past, and it still is today. Now, coming back to our question, what's wrong with the Middle East? If some people have found the answer to that, if I were to ask this gentleman, for instance, Professor Edward Said, okay, I can't ask him because he's deceased, but if I were to be able to ask him, the answer would be very clear. What's wrong with the Middle East? The West is wrong about the Middle East. It's all the West's fault. Everything that's happening in the Middle East is because of the West. You can see here the West caused an immense distortion, generation after generation, a long succession of years, and it continues. It continues to this day, okay? So immense is this distortion in his eyes that he compares it with the Holocaust. And in his opinion, it all started 2 centuries ago, no less, with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. That's when it all started, and it never stopped. Now, the only problem I have with this theory is, yes, Napoleon did invade Egypt with the French army, and he occupied Egypt. But you know, that occupation, and then he moved north from Egypt. He reached in today's Israel, he reached Accra, as it were. But that occupation lasted only 3 years. Historically, this is nothing. It's a blip. It's not a very important, it's never been a very important historical event. Napoleon then returned to Europe, and whatever momentous events he caused in Europe, not in the Middle East. It's true that the Western powers did occupy, did rule parts of the Middle East, but again, look at the lengths of time here. I mean, even 40 years in historical terms is not a very long period of time. If you compare it to the British rule in India, which lasted for almost 200 years, now that's a powerful, an important length of time. Not to mention, if we come back to the Middle East, the Ottoman rule in the Middle East lasted for almost exactly 400 years. Now that's a very important, very momentous stretch of time to leave a lasting influence. So I really don't understand when I hear people like Professor Said blaming the West and so on. Obviously, Western colonialism, had quite a deleterious influence in the Middle East and elsewhere. But how can they ignore the 400 years of Ottoman rule in the Middle East? Surely that was even more important, or at least as important. The Ottomans, let's remember, conquered Constantinople, then they conquered the Middle East, but they didn't continue, they didn't push eastwards. They didn't step in the footsteps of Alexander the Great. They didn't reach the gates of India. They turned their attention back to Europe. They conquered the Balkans and so on. If you look, this is the map of the Ottoman Empire at its peak. Now, I think you can see here that it's most of the landmass is in Europe or near Europe. The capital was Istanbul, former Constantinople, a European city. Yes, they ruled territories in the Middle East, but you can see mostly on the coast. The coast was important strategically, it was important for trade, but that's not where they sought territory. The Ottomans pushed into Europe. That was where they were interested in. They were not very much at all interested in the Middle East. And that's the main reason why the Middle East became, or remained, if you wish, a backwater, a territory, a region underdeveloped from every point of view. And the Ottomans ruled it through, some corrupt and incompetent officials that they sent from Istanbul, and a combination with local notables. Neither category cared very much about developing the region. They cared about their own pockets, quite frankly. But the Ottoman Empire left a very strong legacy. You can imagine, they ruled for 400 years. I wanted to show you this grainy picture. I'm sorry, I couldn't find a better one, but I hope you can see. This is the Pan-Syrian Congress, or later called also the Syrian-Palestinian Congress. The Palestinian Arabs, some Palestinian Arabs at the time, saw themselves as part of Greater Syria, and so they participated in this Congress. Remember, this is 1921. This is at the cusp, the transition period between the Ottoman Empire and the new Western rulers, okay, which took over starting from 1917. So this is the transition. And look at how these people are dressed. Some of them, I hope you can see, are dressed in Western garb, yeah, Western suits of the time, of the period, and some of them donned Turkish, Ottoman garb. You can see the turban, the Ottoman fez, the flowing robes. Okay, so this is a mixture, but these people are not Westerners, and they're not Turks either. These people are Arabs, Syrians, Palestinians, yet not one kafir among the lot of them. Okay, why? Because the Ottomans, like any empire, actively discouraged the development of any sense of national identity and national culture. They actively suppressed it, because nationalism is the opposite of imperialism. It tends to pull apart empires, and they were interested in keeping them together. How did they keep them together? Well, the glue of this particular empire was religion. Islam was the dominant religion in the Ottoman Empire. Not many people remember today that the Sultan, the secular leader, the king, if you wish, or the emperor, was also caliph, khalifa in Arabic, which means successor of the prophet, supreme leader, supreme religious leader of Islam. So this was king and pope rolled into one. You can see how they divided the territory. These divisions, these administration divisions, vilayets or shires, if you wish, they were completely arbitrary. They were generally around a major city, and they paid no attention, these borders paid no attention to the identity of the people who lived there. They crossed through tribal interests and so on. And the Western colonialists that took over did pretty much the same. You can see here the map of the Sykes-Picot, famous Sykes-Picot agreement. I'm sorry about this typo. And you can see the border that they drew here. Again, a completely arbitrary border with no regard for whoever lives there, you know, on each side of that border. You can see this very well from the names that they gave to the new territories they constituted in the Middle East, the colonialists. These are foreign names, they're Greek names, they're not local names, they're not Middle Eastern names. Lebanon, named after the range of mountains. Mesopotamia is what we call today Iraq. They called it Mesopotamia, again, a Greek name. Palestine, another Greek name. Egypt, yet another Greek name. You know, Egyptians don't call their country, and Arabs in general, they don't call Egypt Egypt or anything that sounds like that. They call it Misr or Masr. That's something, if you remember the Hebrew name Mitzrayim, you know, this is the old name. It comes from the old name of that territory. But the colonialists were not interested in that. They called it Egypt because that's their culture was the continuation of the ancient Greek and Roman culture, and they took the names from there. Perhaps the funniest name is Transjordan. You know, then when they decided to take this territory away from the original mandate of Palestine and constitute it into an emirate, they were looking for a name, but they didn't have any name here. And the place is rather barren and without features that could give a name. It's mostly desert, with the exception of the Jordan River. But the Jordan River doesn't flow through the middle of the country, it flows on one side. And so they decided to call it Transjordan, which means across the Jordan River. But of course, if you live there, it's not across the Jordan River, it's here. It's only across the Jordan River if you see it from the west, from London, right? So you can see here already that we have problems, not just with the regional identity, but also the national identities. The various rulers that ruled that territory, starting with the Ottomans, did not allow the development of national identities. That's not to say that people in the Middle East don't have identities. Of course, we all have identities. That's what makes us human beings. We all have identities. But so they have, for instance, linguistic identities, you know, given by the language that they speak. Arabs means speakers of the Arabic language. They have identities given by the religion of the faith they believe in. They have tribal and clan identities. But what I'm saying, so it's not that they don't have identities. What I'm saying is, if you look at these national borders, they have nothing in common with the identities of the peoples living there. They cross through those identities and they live inside people that have various identities. Okay, that's a problem. But again, the colonialists were not interested in all that. They had no interest. All they wanted was colonies. They wanted the colonies because of their strategic value and because sometimes because of their economic value, certain natural resources and so on. Why did they call them mandates and not colonies? For the simple reason that this happened after World War I. Remember, in World War I, I'm sorry, the Americans kind of saved our bacon. They are very important, a strong power. And the Americans didn't like the term colonies. I wonder why. Because they were themselves colonies once and they had to fight for their freedom. So the decision was to call them mandates. It's like we got an authorization to rule over these territories and these people. Why? Because the colonialists did not believe that these people can rule themselves. you know, they're primitive, they're underdeveloped. We have to take care of them. We have to rule over them. But how are we, as a handful of Europeans, going to rule over such large territories? We can do it by involving certain local notables. We're going to rule over the notables, influence the notables, and they're going to rule over their countrymen. And that's how they came up with these dictators, which they enthroned as kings and emirs and so on. You can see here the Hashemites, the Hashemite family, and it didn't matter that they were not actually kings and that they were not even local to some of these countries. They came from a different place. It didn't matter. Some of these royal dynasties still rule to this day. And some were toppled, but when they were toppled, they were not replaced by democracies, they were replaced by other dictators. And all the difference was that the new dictators called themselves presidents and not kings. But they continued to rule as dictators, as absolute dictators. So now we kind of get a hint of something else that's wrong with the Middle East. You see, this is an organization that researches and publishes every year a report about the state of freedom in the various countries. Now, if you organize those countries by region, you get something like that. You can see here that the Middle East and North Africa is at the bottom of the pile. It's arguably the most unfree region, most undemocratic region in the entire world. So now we have another problem here, the absence of freedom. And I'm going to, you know, we have absence of freedom and weak identities. And I'd like to quote here somebody I respect very much, Natan Sharansky. And he said something very clever. He said, if you want healthy societies and you want a peaceful world, you need two things. You need identity and you need democracy. And there's a certain relationship between those two concepts. So in other words, we need freedom and identity. And, you know, I put here a definition of identity, if you wish, but it's a form of social solidarity, isn't it? That's what identity is. It's solidarity even with people with the same identity that we don't even know. We never met them, and yet there is this solidarity. That's identity. So now we understand what's wrong with the Middle East. So for a healthy society and a peaceful world, we need freedom and identity. And in the Middle East, we have a lack of freedom and we have weak identities. Now, I'm not going to finish here, but just to break the rhythm a little bit and make it a little bit more interactive, what I'd like to do is to stop just for a few minutes and maybe answer 2-3 questions before I move on what we've seen so far.
Okay. Right. Could you possibly take down your the screen share so I can see what's going on, please, Noru? Thank you. And gallery view. Let's have a look. Now, I think Johnny Hill's got his hand up. Johnny.
You've got to unmute yourself.
He's done. He has done.
Thank you. So you talked about the Silk Road and you talked about the location of the Middle East between all the major continents. You didn't mention what's today so fundamentally new and important, the Suez Canal, over which the continents have fought, which they never did over the Silk Road.
Okay. First of all, I'm not sure I agree they didn't fight over the Silk Road, but your remark is a very, very good one, and thank you very much, Johnny. Indeed, the Suez Canal is also very important. It cuts the shipping time between the continents, and it's yet another way in which the Middle East is a bridge, is a passage, a place of passage. So thank you for, bringing even more evidence to the point I was trying to make, that this is a place of passage, a bridge, if you wish. Okay. A canal is nothing but a water bridge, isn't it? A shipping bridge.
Okay. I'd now like to ask Roger Katinsky, who's got his hand up.
Thank you. My question actually is a very simple one. Had the mandate not been given to Britain at the end of the First World War, what then might have happened in that part of the world when you consider that the Jews were at that time only a small minority in a largely Muslim Palestinian country?
Yes. So what would that happen? First of all, we're dealing in what ifs and a very hypothetical question, but if I can venture, so we can only speculate. Now, if you want me to speculate, actually, I don't believe it would have made so much of a difference. And I'll explain. I think there are historical forces that are very, very difficult to stop. And Zionism was such a force. People forget that before 1917, there had already been two large waves of aliyah, of immigration of Jews to Palestine. That's before the mandate. So two large waves, even before the mandate. There were three more after the mandate was instituted, okay? People also forget that the Zionists did not start dealing with the British right away. They started actually to deal with the Ottoman Sultan. Theodor Herzl visited the Sultan, had an audience or a couple of audiences, I think, with the Sultan and various Ottoman high functionaries. And it's not that the Sultan was Zionist or the vizier the high vizier was a Zionist, but they were corruptible, And as we know, as happened in Britain as well, the Zionists were good at creating the impression that behind them there's a huge force of the global Jewry, the force of money and the force of influence and so on, okay? And that worked to a certain extent on the Sultan as well. That's why there were two waves of immigration while the place was ruled by the Ottomans. In the end, under the pressure from the Arabs, some of the notables of the Arabs wrote to the Sultan and asked him to prohibit the immigration of Jews. And the Sultan did that. He prohibited the immigration of Jews from Europe to, what was to become Palestine or Israel today. But that law, that Ottoman law, was very poorly implemented because the Ottoman administration was A, incompetent, and B, corrupt, okay? And so while dealing in hypotheticals and in speculation, I can speculate that if the place had remained under Ottoman rule, it may well be that the same thing would have happened, the same Zionist immigration and organization inside and the Yishuv and so on.
Okay. Jeff Wolfson, I believe you've got a question.
Yes, I've noticed that Algeria is particularly hostile to Israel, even though it doesn't have a border, and it's much more hostile than other Arab countries. Is there a reason for this? Algeria. Is there a reason for this? And does it have an effect in France has a large Algerian diaspora community?
I think there is a reason for that. The Algerians, let's remember, fought the French colonialists. Other Arabs didn't have to fight. The Iraqis, the Syrians, they didn't have to kick the French and the British out by force of arms. But the Algerians did have to mount an armed war of liberation, let's say, against the French. And so in their minds, because of course they are being told, as it is being told in much of the Arab world, that Jews have no connection to the land of Israel. And so they see them as colonialists, and they identify with, they identify the Israelis with the French colonialists in Algeria. That's perhaps why this happens.
Okay.
Okay, I think that's enough for now. We'll have a lot more questions at the end.
Okay.
I'd like to move on because I've got a bit more. Okay, so there is something in the Middle East that we didn't talk about yet. We talked about freedom and identity, but we didn't talk about the role of religion. This is a random page from a random Saudi governmental website. And the only thing I'm interested in on this page is this bit here. I'm going to make it bigger so we can read. So you can see here, January 2021. So this is the date, but what is this? What's this? This, folks, is the Islamic date, according to the Islamic calendar. This is the month, and this is the year, 1442. And this is not unusual in the Middle East. It's not just in Saudi Arabia. This is a page from an Israeli government website. You can see here 2021, right? And next to it, what do you see? Hatashpa. What does that mean? It's the year 5781. So you might have thought that we live in 2021, but that it depends who you're asking, you know. There are different points of view. Now, these year counts, they start from a particular event that is relevant to that religion. We know in Judaism, it's what we see as the creation of the world, right? Christianity, the count starts with the birth of Jesus. And in Islam, it starts with the Hijrah, with the flight of Muhammad, Prophet Muhammad, from Mecca to what was Yathrib at the time. But it's not just any event that these numbers commemorate. It's kind of a formative event, a foundational event of that religion. So what these numbers tell us, they are an indication. They don't tell us exactly, but they are a good indication of the age of that religion. So we have a very old religion, we have a pretty mature religion, and we have a young religion, perhaps a teenager religion. Now, what do we associate with youth? I don't know most of you, but I kind of suspect that, like me, when you were younger, you were enthusiastic, you were impetuous, you were probably a bit impulsive. And you know what, if we are honest, you might have been also a bit intolerant of the many failures of your fellow men, because that's youth. As we grow old, we mellow down a little bit. We realize that we are not saints ourselves, and we become more forgiving of the faults of other people. And that happens not just to young people, but also to young human endeavors, such as young religions. That's why in Islam, we are more likely to find a certain proportion of religious zealotry. It's not that we don't have zealots in Judaism. It's not that we don't have Christian zealots. We do. But the proportion, the relative proportion is slightly less. And it's also not that all Muslims or most Muslims, in fact, the vast majority of Muslims are not zealots. But you're more likely to find zealots in this younger religion than in the more mature, more established one. I mean, Islam is in its 15th century, and we know what happened in the 15th century of Christianity. And you know, if you look through these events, I think we can get a better understanding of some of the things that zealots do today. Zealots such as the so-called Islamic State. Okay, they burn people. They behead people, they're intolerant to minorities. For instance, the Christians in the territories they occupied, they gave them 3 options: to convert to Islam, welcome, to be killed, or to flee the territory, to go away. And these are exactly the options given to Jews in the 15th century of Christianity. So you can see here the parallel, and I think it gives us a little bit of understanding of some of the things that are happening in the Middle East these days. Now, religion aside, demographic facts. This is a very fast growing population, arguably the fastest growing in the world. This is the ratio of population in 2000 versus half a century before that. You can see in that interval, the population of Europe grew by some 30%. The population of the Middle East and North Africa grew by almost 300%. And this continues, not exactly at the same pace. So in the next 50 years, the population will not quadruple itself, but it will almost double itself. And the result of that is a very young population. The population of the Middle East has a much higher proportion of youth than Europe, for instance. And the problem is that these young people don't see a very bright future in front of them. There is unemployment. I mean, I'm showing you this data on unemployment, which I nicked from the International Monetary Fund. But quite frankly, I don't believe in it. This is data that is sent by or collected and sent by the governments of these countries. I'm not so sure they collect it well and they are genuine about it, they're honest about it. Also, I'm not sure what it includes. Does it include women, for instance? In many of these places, women are not expected to work when they get married. And also, one thing that I know it does not include is this. There's a large proportion of the ones that do have jobs. They have jobs in the public sector, jobs that are, frankly speaking, not really needed. They're given jobs, but these are not productive jobs. In fact, I would venture that they are counterproductive jobs. They generate bureaucracy, they encourage corruption, not very satisfactory jobs. Jobs aside, there isn't even enough water in many of these places, especially as the population grows. There's less and less water available, not everywhere, but in many of these places. And it's not just that there isn't enough water, but there isn't planning on how to get water in the future. The population continues to grow. The water reserves continue to be depleted. So the situation, as you can see, is getting worse and worse. If there isn't water, there is something else. There is oil and gas. But there is also, in many places, over-reliance on this resource. You can see 50% of the GDP in Saudi Arabia is oil and gas. Just to give you a term of comparison, we all know that the financial sector is very important to the British economy. It's very important, but it's about 20%, not 50% of the GDP. So this over-reliance is certainly not healthy. But if the oil and gas sector is overdeveloped, something else is underdeveloped. The human factor, the human resource, the human asset, the most important asset of all is underdeveloped. The education is poor, the healthcare is poor, and so on. So now I think we can add to our list of problems. We should add religious zealotry, and we should add, I call it in general poor governance. Poor governance. It results in poverty, it results in many things. Social mistrust, very, very problematic thing. These are populations that have an acerbic mistrust of their leaders. And why wouldn't they? These are not leaders that they chose, that they elected, and they're not very good leaders. So why would they trust them? But this affects the social solidarity. It affects the capability of these countries to progress. So, many people represent, when they talk about the Middle East, they think about barrels of oil. But another way to see the Middle East is as a powder keg. So we have this, these barrels of TNT, of explosive, and we have this guy with the open flame. So what does that mean? Are we going to have an explosion? Is that what I'm saying? Well, not necessarily, not necessarily. As human beings, we've been given choice. We know that. It can actually go either way. We might have an explosion, but we might not. It could go in a good way. It could go towards freedom and democracy. We know that people have begun already to call for a change, for democracy and so on. It didn't quite work when they did it, but at least they started. So it might succeed next time. We might see a move towards democracy, towards freedom, towards different identity and so on. But it could also go the other way, towards death, towards war, even nuclear war. The thing that is most concerning about Iran's nuclear program is not that Iran will get the bomb. That's concerning, I agree. But there's something even more concerning, that other Middle Eastern countries will also pursue a nuclear arsenal. If there is one thing that we should all consider frightening beyond imagination even, is the image of the Middle East with nuclear weapons. Countries aiming nuclear weapons at each other in this very unstable region. God forbid that happens. So what can we do to help the situation go towards the good, in the good direction? How can we choose life? Well, I kind of enumerated the problems, the issues in the Middle East. So it's kind of obvious. We should encourage and stimulate, or at least not hinder, expressions of identity in the Middle East. We should encourage democracy and freedom. We should provide help with good governance, even economic aid, but constructive economic aid, perhaps a Marshall Plan for the Middle East. And remember, I showed you that graph with the human assets. So how do we change? How do we get the human asset to progress? There's only one way: education. There's no other way to change people except education. So this is what we've got to do. But are we actually doing this? Let's see. Are we encouraging expressions of identity? These are three leaders of the free world, leaders of the West. They got together in 2003, they put out a declaration, and what did they say? We want to keep Iraq as a unified country, they said. We want. Who are you to want that? But we want to keep them all together in the same country. The Sunni Arabs, the Shiite Arabs, Kurds, Turkmen, Assyrians, Chaldeans, doesn't matter. They should live together in a united country, they said. And they succeeded in that. Iraq is a united country, more or less. I mean, the Kurds have extensive autonomy. But it's theoretically a united country. But as these authors and researchers remarked, it is a unified country, but a nation, it ain't. It's never been a nation, it isn't a nation, and probably it will never be a nation. Unified sounds like a positive word. But is it always a good thing to keep people forcibly in some sort of artificial framework, like an artificial state? Is it always a good thing? You know, we had such a state in Europe. It was called Yugoslavia. And we thought it was a real state. It turns out it was an artificial state, just like Iraq. And just like Iraq, it was held together in the iron fist of a dictator. The moment the dictator died, it fell apart and people started butchering each other. But unlike in Iraq, in Yugoslavia, we intervened and we helped them separate. They separated into nation states. And since then, they've been living in peace. Not just in peace, they start to discover friendship and good neighborliness. I'm going to show you something.
And finally,
Sono dalla 12 puan.
go to Ljubice,
Tabii Sırbistan'a gidiyor. Aynen söylediğin.
I don't know if you are able to hear that, but this is from the Eurovision Song Contest. And the young lady you see here is the representative of Bosnia, and she has just communicated that the Bosnian public has given maximum points, 12 points, 12 points, to Serbia. To Serbia. Bosnians and Serbians killed each other like there was no tomorrow. But this is a few years later. They separated in nation states, and now suddenly they remember that they're actually closer to Serbs than they are to Britain. They didn't give 12 points to the UK, nobody does. They gave it to Serbia. So maybe that's what we should do. Maybe instead of insisting that Iraq should, and other countries in the Middle East should remain united and, everybody living together like it was, the time of the Messiah, maybe we should help them express their identity and separate into units, into nation states or other forms of units that they feel comfortable with, that accord, that agree with their identity. Maybe we shouldn't insist that they continue to live within the artificial border that some colonial politician drew on a map once upon a time. Maybe that's not the right thing to do. Okay, are we helping them choose democracy? Are we doing that? No, folks, we're not doing that. In fact, some of the representatives that we're sending to these people who don't have a tradition of democracy, we're sending them people like this guy, Andrew Green, former British ambassador to Syria and Saudi Arabia. And Mr. Green does not believe that Western democracy is suitable for the Middle East. You know, these Middle Eastern people, democracy won't work there. It'll never work there, he says. Why? Because in the Middle East, family, tribe, sect, and personal friendships trump the apparatus of the state, he says. Now, I don't disagree with that. I think family is important everywhere. Faith is important everywhere. Personal friendships. I think the problem is with the apparatus of the state, not with the other things. And what does he mean by Western democracy? What's that Western democracy? This is a racist term. There isn't such a term. Democracy is not a cultural trait. It's a general human aspiration. Even the term democracy and the concept of democracy started in ancient Greece, not exactly West. And yes, it works in the West today, but it also works in Japan. Japan is not a Western culture. South Korea, India, Israel. So I don't think that democracy is reserved for certain people and not for other people. I think that every human being craves the freedom and identity. And I think every human being deserves freedom and identity. And if Mr. Andrew Green wants to believe otherwise, then he is welcome. But why are we sending to the Middle East people like this that themselves don't believe in democracy and don't believe that human beings deserve it, all deserve it? What is the message that we are giving to Middle Easterners if we send such ambassadors, such envoys? And what is the message that we are sending to the Middle East when, we put in the same pot, in the same bag, a democratic country and a terrorist organization? What is the message that we are sending here? Are we encouraging democracy by doing this? Are we providing help with good governance? Are we really? No, we don't. We encourage dictators. We smile on the side of the, side by side with the dictators. And it's not just the politicians. Our media as well, often. You see, democratically elected president. Does this journalist from the New York Times even understand what democracy is? How about constructive aid? You remember, not any economic aid, constructive aid, aid that helps the people in question. So we are being told by the Independent that the Biden administration wants to restore economic aid to Palestinians. But the picture that the Independent put here is a picture not of Palestinians, but of the Palestinian Legislative Council. Why? Because even the Independent understands that this money is never going to reach the Palestinians. It's going to reach the Palestinian leadership, the unelected and unrepresentative Palestinian leadership. They're going to pocket some of it, and they're going to use the rest of it to buy themselves support, to buy themselves influence. Is this constructive aid to the Palestinians? I'm 150% in favor of aid to the Palestinians, but this is not aid to the Palestinians. This is aiding exactly the people who oppress the Palestinians. So why are we doing all this? Well, sometimes because, quite frankly, some of our leaders are stupid. They don't understand all this. Some of them are driven by ideology, wokeness, this feeling of colonial guilt, as if they are to blame and not their distant ancestors. But often our leadership does that because, quite frankly, they don't care. They don't care for the people who live in the Middle East. They don't give a damn about them. All the freedom, identity, they don't care. All they want from them is stability. This is a term you will hear a lot in the context of the Middle East. If you listen to politicians, to some of our politicians, you'll hear a lot the word stability. That's what they need from these people, to sit quietly in their place and not come to Europe, because we don't want so many immigrants, and also don't engage in terrorism, and don't revolt against the rulers. Just stay there quietly. That's what we need from them, and let us have the oil, because that's what we need. And to hell with all the values that we pretend we have. Right? That's what we are doing. And what about education? This is a page from a Palestinian textbook, a textbook that is used in the Palestinian Authority. We've translated it here. This is a maths textbook, okay, for year 4. This is how they teach maths. This is how they teach physics to year 7. Lionizing a terrorist. This is a terrorist. She killed that woman for the only fault that she was Jewish and she was on a beach in Israel. She did this, and she's being lionized in a textbook for year 5. Zionists set the Al-Aqsa Mosque on fire. Palestine from the river to the sea. The liberation of Al-Aqsa Mosque is the duty of every Muslim. Jerusalem is an Arab city built by our Arab forefathers thousands of years ago, and it's a holy city for Muslims and Christians, full stop. If you thought that this is the Western Wall, also called sometimes the Wailing Wall, you're wrong. This is Al-Burak Wall, and it's not part of the temple complex. It's part of Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the Muslims alone have absolute right to it. Now, why am I showing you all this? I'm not picking in particular on the Palestinians. I can guarantee to you there are even worse things in textbooks throughout the Middle East, not just in the Palestinian Authority. But the reason I show you these textbooks is that most of you folks, if you pay taxes in this country, you paid for this. A small part of the taxes you pay is used to print these textbooks. Okay. And also, a part of your taxes is used to maintain the BBC. And the BBC is a wonderful, wonderful tool. It broadcasts in many, many languages, among them Arabic. Very important tool. You can use it for positive propaganda, not negative propaganda, positive propaganda, education. But how is it being used? They lionized, BBC Arabic lionized a terrorist, not a suspected terrorist, a terrorist who freely admitted, she proudly stated her actions, which were to help murder innocent people, including children, in a restaurant. This is the person that BBC Arabic lionized. So we're not doing very well in helping, in choosing life. We're not actually choosing life in what we're doing. I'm saying we, generally, the West, the free world, if you wish. Our record with all these things, our track record is very poor. And quite frankly, if we want to choose life rather than choosing death and war, we need to change all this. That's all I wanted to tell you today. I wanted to leave you with this thought, and I'm ready to answer questions if you have any. Thank you very much for your attention.
If you could just take the screen share down, please. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much, Noru. Questions are absolutely piling in. The first person that's a hand up is Steve. Steve, would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Hi, good evening. How are you all? I have a question. I'm not sure how to word this right. Well, it goes something like this. Like, we know our Arab supporting friends, Joseph Stalin coined the phrase useful idiots. Why do we continually refer to those itinerant Arabs as Palestinian when we know that's not what they actually are? Because if we want to take control of the narrative, why don't we call them Arabs and point out to everybody else they're Arabs? So if we throw a little pebble in the water and the truth, that particular truth should ripple out. Why isn't that being done for us to gain control of the issues, plural?
Because, quite frankly, because I don't think it's for us to do something like that. I think that goes, quite frankly, I think that goes against everything that I did say, because it, you know, I'm in favor of encouraging people's identity, and it's not up to me to decide what their identity is. It's up to them. Hold on, Steve.
Go on.
Just as you know, my identity is Jewish. You know, apart from being a human being, I'm a Jew, and I wouldn't like people to tell me what my identity should be. I don't want this, and so I don't want to do it to somebody else. It may well be that you are right, and they will have a free debate whenever they attain freedom. They will have a free debate, and they will decide, you know what, we don't need this Palestinian thing. We are Arabs, and you know, we want to live, for instance, in a unified Arab state, a federal Arab state. I don't know. It's not up to me. It's not up to me. It's up to them. From my point of view, I need from them just one thing. I'm ready to give them, you know, their identity and the manifestation of their identity, including a state, whatever they wish, okay? With one proviso. That
just one?
Yes, that they make peace and they keep peace, okay? And allow me—
That's a fairly big one, to be fair.
And allow me, yes, well, it's a big one. It's also a very obvious one, okay?
Obvious to most people, but not all.
Because if somebody comes to you with a knife, you know, you're going to, at the very least, you're going to hold his hands so he doesn't stab you. Now, somebody may come and say, but you don't allow this person his freedom. You're holding his hands. Well, hold his hands so he doesn't kill me. I'm more than willing to give him his freedom, but not his freedom to kill me. And that's
the paradox of tolerance. That one.
Perhaps.
We're going to move on to somebody else for a question. Steve Wolfing, did you have a question, or was that the Steve I was just talking to? Okay.
Yes.
David Summers, would you like to unmute yourself? I think you had a question.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. Noru, I'm just going to the beginning of your talk. You talked about the strategic interest of this area, however you wish to define Middle East, and you said it's a combination of geography and energy. I'd like to suggest that it's going to become less of a strategic interest over the next, to the West, in quotes, over the next 20, 30 years, as the energy component is going to decline. It's going to, in fact, be quite a almost stranded assets, the way things are going. You can see this already, that when there is an upset in Saudi or in Iran, the price of oil hardly moves. So I think I take a bit of an issue with that. And then in terms of how to make the situation better, whilst you've talked a lot about the Palestinians and so on, if we just go to some of the other countries as well, like Saudi, how do you introduce democracy in an environment like that, where you can kill Mr. Khashoggi and there is not hardly a ripple in the world? Or in the UAE, which is very much top of the news today, and so on. So let's not just talk about Palestinians. I understand exactly what you say, and neighbors have been doing a lot about that. I just want to look at it in broader terms, because I also have a lot of experience in that part of the world. Yeah.
So if I
may just close out, because you picked up this ambassador, I think what he was saying is that democracy is not a concept that many people in that part of the world understand. They want to, the way they conduct their lives is very tribal, and they don't want democracy as we, which is our interpretation, developed by the Greeks and the Romans, understand it. So, you know, and I'm just trying to broaden it out a bit.
So let me try to answer the three things. First of all, regarding energy, you know, this is a part of the work. What I'm doing here is my hobby. Okay, part of the work that I'm doing has to do somehow with energy. I happen to know one has to separate the blurb and the propaganda from the facts. If you switch on the BBC or Sky, I don't want to pick on BBC, any of the traditional media, these days you hear a lot about sustainable energy and electric cars and all these new forms of energy. You know, if you look at the facts and at the numbers, I can tell you that the entire contribution all over the world of renewable energy today is something like 5 or 6%. And most of the rest, with the exception of nuclear power and hydroelectric power, all of the rest is fossil fuel, including not just oil and gas, but coal, which is much dirtier, much more polluting than oil and gas. So the truth of the matter is that we're not going to be able to get rid of oil and gas for many years to come, decades. I'm not saying we will eventually get rid of them, but it'll take decades. If you think it's going to happen tomorrow, then you're being duped by certain politicians who would like you to believe that, but it's not true. That's one point. The second point, I wasn't referring with democracy just to Palestinians. I was referring to the entire Middle East. The Palestinians are a small part of the Middle East. Now, I beg to disagree. I know what Mr. Andrew Green said, and what he said was that Western democracy will never work in the Middle East. Now, I agree with you, there are tribal things, but let me tell you something, David. I was born, I think you can hear quite a heavy accent. I was born in Eastern Europe. I was born in a communist country, ruled by dictators. If someone would have told me then that that country will become democratic and will be accepted into the European Union in a few short years, I would have said he's out of his mind or she's out of his mind. Okay? Things that, and it's not just me, you know, we had scientists, we call them Sovietologues. What did the Sovietologues say? It'll never change. Germany will never be unified. The Soviet Union, will be forever. The Eastern Europe will be in the sphere of influence of Soviet Union, and so on and so forth. Things change. Why do they change? Because people in Eastern Europe did not have a tradition of democracy. They didn't have a tradition of democracy, and they were kept pretty oppressed and primitive by the communists. But people naturally, as it's written in the American Constitution, people naturally desire freedom. It's a human thing. We might not be able, and the Middle Eastern people might not be able to define it as well as you can, David, but they crave it. They crave it nonetheless. They might not understand all the time how to achieve it and what it can bring them and so on. But, I believe we will get there. I believe we will get there. And your third thing was, remind me, sorry.
Okay.
I'll defer. I think other people, because I'm watching the clock as well. So let's move on to somebody else. Thank you for your responses.
Right. Thank you. Time is moving on. I'm only going to allow, despite being absolutely flooded out with questions, a couple more questions. Steve Wolfing, did you want to ask something?
Yes, I did. How genuine is the perceived change of heart by Saudi Arabia towards Israel?
Okay, well, and that reminds me of the third thing of David, so I'll answer them together. It's look, it's a marriage of interest. It's not a marriage of love, as you understand. But on the other hand, some of the, I'm not promoting marriages of interest, God forbid, but some of the best things in the world, in diplomatic terms and in political terms, come actually from joint interest, from shared interests. It's actually, in international, if you sign an international agreement, you sign a peace treaty, it will only hold because you can't really enforce an international agreement except by war. So the international agreements that actually hold are the ones where the interests bring the parties together. And so, yeah, I believe there's a shared interest, and that's not such a bad basis for that relationship. Okay, and I think with my example of Eastern Europe, I think I might have responded to David also on the issue of Saudi Arabia and the Emirates.
For the last question, I'm going to ask Valerie Fisher.
Okay, good evening. You mentioned about the zealots amongst young people. I was wondering why there are so many, or appear to be many more zealots in Islam, or why the number appears to have grown in the last 20 or 30 years. Do you have an answer for that?
Well, first of all, I don't believe it's grown, actually. I think we just became more aware of them because some of them directed their ire and some of their ire towards us, towards the West, or towards Israel and so on, or towards Jews. I don't think there are more of them. There might actually be fewer of them.
Well, they keep laying themselves up. So that's...
political Islam didn't start today. It started 100 years ago, and before that it had other names, but it existed. Zealotry, and I don't talk about zealotry of young people in particular. I talk about zealotry of in a younger religion, and I think they before that they directed it mostly against other Muslims. They still do.
Mhm.
And we now have become more aware of that problem because they started to direct it against us as well.
Do you think the breakup of the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, was a deciding factor or a factor in that?
Well, it certainly was a factor. I think one of the factors, as I said, is the actual age of the religion. It's a more militant religion because it's a younger one. And so more people are militant in that religion, while in older religions, you know, things have mellowed down a little bit. That's one reason. The other reason, I think, it's a feeling of, how should I call it? Lack of self-satisfaction, lack of satisfaction with themselves. Because you see, we forget that when Islam started, you know, there were centuries when Muslims were the most developed societies, civilizations around. Okay, if you look at Spain, the Muslims who ruled in Spain were much more civilized, if you wish. Their culture was more advanced than of the Christians who replaced them.
Mhm.
And they remember this. You know, we have things like algebra that comes, even the name is Arabic.
Yeah.
It was invented by Arabs. So they had extremely good scientists. Some of the best early doctors were Arabs, artists, culture people, poets, and so on, architects. They remember that. They remember the glory, the former glory of Islam. And it's a frustration. They look at the Muslim majority, many of the Muslim majority countries today, and you know, they tend to be less developed, less advanced,
Yeah.
and they ask themselves why. And for some, the answer is because we didn't keep our adherence, our faith properly.
Right.
Okay, so what they would want is a return to the glory of Islam, of the, you know, the 9th century and the 10th century and the 7th century, which they see as the ideal.
Yeah.
That's you know, part of the push there.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. I know that lots and lots of you have got hands up. I've got questions piling in all over the show, but time has really caught up with us. I'd like to ask Jack Green to propose a vote of thanks to you, Noru.
Thank you, Alan. Before I say anything to Noru and to praise him for a fascinating, fantastic presentation, I'd just like to clear with all our viewers and listeners tonight that we are no way, our family are no way connected to a former British ambassador to Syria or Saudi Arabia. So I just want to say that, you know, I've listened to many of your presentations, Noru, at the Mood, and quite a few after that. And the thing that stands out from all your presentations, there's two things actually. The first is that your preparation is quite substantial. You are actually doing something which is, you are being very respectful of your audience by preparing yourself so well and allowing us to understand your points by compiling so many beautiful slides which are so interesting and help to advance your argument. The other thing about you, Noru, is that, and here again this evening, it's exactly the same, you seem to have an idiosyncratic view of the world. When we gave you this, or we discussed this subject, there was no way that we could have predicted that this is the way you were going to treat it. So if anybody really wants to understand how unique a mind you have, then I suggest that they start logging into your blog. What do you call it again? I can't remember, but something about unpolitical.
Politically incorrect politics. But
politically
you can read
incorrect.
my
That's right.
articles if you search on the website of Times of Israel for my name, you'll find my articles there.
Well, politically incorrect, it's not just politically incorrect, it's also very totally incorrect in many, many ways, and you're really fascinating. So I think your knowledge of history, your knowledge of the characters in history makes so many interesting things about the way in which you present your case, as you do on many, many occasions, and have given us this thirst to learn more about the situation that you have actually raised this evening. And we thank you very much. And I ask everybody to unmute and thank you, Noru, for a very, very stimulating evening. Thank you very much indeed.
Applause,
Thank
applause.
you, guys. Thank you for having me. And it's been entirely my pleasure. Thank you.
Those of you who have questions which I've not been able to answer in the chat, just send it to via the website through the office. It'll come through to me. I'll be able to answer that tomorrow. So thank you everybody for joining us tonight. It's been a great evening. We'll see you again in the near future, and thank you again, Noru.